heard of Carmilla, the 19th century lesbian vampire novel? Well, this book contains a lot of snippets of vampire lore, specifically about the vampire pandemic, which I am very eager to talk about. But first, a quick explanation of what Carmilla is. Carmilla is a novel by Sheridan Le Fanu about a lady vampire who goes exclusively after women. Amongst the working class she kills indiscriminately, but amongst the wealthy, one will be chosen for her to take her time with, get to know, kill slowly and intimately. And although this book was written by a Victorian man, it actually depicts women really well, and I am shook. Although content warning in the book for racism, it's brief, but it is unfortunately bad and there. Although this is not the first time a vampire lady has been written about, there are a few poems about them. It is the first, at least as far as I'm aware, and at least in English, that was girl-on-girl vamp action. Bram Stoker even took inspiration for his vampire brides from Carmilla. It is the OG girly vampire book. So now onto the inspiration for Carmilla, the vampire pandemic. Carmilla was written in 1872, 53 years after the first vampire books, Polydorus the Vampire and Byron's The Fragment, published in 1819. And whilst The Vampire and The Fragment had their own vampire lore, Carmilla is heavily steeped in the incidents of the Great Vampire Pandemic, a plague that was believed to be spread by, you guessed it, vampires. This vampire pandemic began in Eastern Europe in the early mid-18th century and lasted roughly 30 years. 30 years of mass sickness and death. The early vampires weren't biters of necks and feasters of blood, they were plague spreaders. There were many illnesses back then that people had no idea where they came from, and because they couldn't be explained, they were blamed on these vampires. One of the original illnesses that is thought to have been spread by these vampires is thought to be because of the introduction of corn. Because it was a cheap food and easy to grow, it became a staple in times of famine. But eating too much cornmeal and not enough other food groups can give you pellagra, a vitamin B and thiamine deficiency, which caused, amongst other things, sensitivity to light, lethargy and sores. Kind of like if you only eat rabbit, you can starve to death unless you eat other foods, which is good to know in survival situations. The lethargy part was used to great effect in Carmilla, although lethargy is a common part of many illnesses and could have been a reference to consumption, aka tuberculosis, and tuberculosis was what the vampires were accused of spreading when it came to the West and was the main influence in Dracula. However, for Carmilla, when the vampire feeds on anyone that isn't her favourite victim, they describe a feeling like they're being strangled and they pass after a few days, which I believe comes from how the pandemic itself is thought to have been started. In Serbia, vampires were already established as a small part of folklore, but because of one man they exploded into a full-blown creation of panic that spread to the West. This man was a former military man called Arnold Paul, who thought that whilst he was serving in Kosovo, he had been attacked by a vampire. To prevent himself becoming one himself, he ate dirt from a vampire's grave and smeared himself in blood. The villagers were a bit suspicious that rather than saving him from vampirism, eating the dirt may have in fact turned him. So after Paule died in a hay wagon accident, a lot of other people started saying that Paule had been visiting them at night, strangling them, and days later they would die. So an inquest was held. Arnold's grave was opened, he'd been buried 40 days by that time, and people thought he still looked too fresh. And so he was labelled vampire, and a vampire burial commenced. He was staked through the heart, decapitated, his body was then burnt and his ashes scattered into the river, just as they were in Carmilla. Vampire burials basically means using any method possible to make sure that the deceased doesn't rise, like a stake through the heart, removal of the head, etc., which if the measures aren't done pre-burial, they would reopen the grave of the suspected vampire to carry them out. Burning wasn't always the go-to method, but burning did seem to be a widespread solution. There is a burial site in England in the Yorkshire village of Warren Percy that contains 100 skeletons dating back to the 14th century that are burned, broken, and deliberately mutilated to prevent the dead returning to harm the living. They were probably thought to be revenants, corpses that rose to haunt the living, instead of vampires, because vampires didn't really exist in the West back then. Back in Eastern Europe pre-14th century, vampires were still very much thought to be a thing, and there was such a spate of vampire burials that there were laws put in place by both church and state that tried to prevent people from conducting them without an inquest, because they kept coming across open graves or people digging up graves to perform these things, hence the need to summon someone to investigate Arnold's grave. I find it strangely pleasing that in Carmilla, Le Fanu includes that before they can even open the casket of the vampire, a commissioner had to be summoned to hold an inquisition and to write an imperial commission report. And once all that vampire paperwork is done and the body had its vampire burial, they too scattered the ashes into the river. And that attention to detail is just nice. I like an author that does their research. But going back some years after Arnold's reburial, 17 people died in quick succession, and they thought it was a vampire again. So a regimental field surgeon, Johannes Furchinger, was sent by the Austrian Empire to investigate. He examined the bodies and interviewed folks. Apparently the bodies seemed suspiciously free of decomp. It was in the middle of winter, but the act of frozen ground on body preservation wasn't known about then, so the regimental field surgeon gave the official okie dokie to have the bodies beheaded, burned, and the ashes thrown into the river. He then wrote a report that was okayed by the medical community, which officially declared that the source of the whole thing was, I don't think you're prepared for this, vampire cows. Apparently Paule had sucked some of the blood of the cows that the townspeople then ate and who were then turned. This medical report, combined with the fact that soldiers were coming home from the war in Serbia to Austria and Germany, were talking about what they had witnessed about the reality of vampire folklore, and this spread the fear of vampires across Europe and into literature. Spinning away from the vampire pandemic and into a few other bits of vampire lore that are mentioned in Carmilla are the vampires laying in blood in their coffins. This is partly because of lead-lined coffins, which preserve a body by preventing moisture from leaking into it, but a body still oozes, and because of the lead, the liquid inside the coffin has nowhere to go, so the body just sort of steeps in a juice that looks a lot like blood. Also, the body produces gases, which is why it can be dangerous to open a lead-lined coffin, and also lead poisoning is a thing. Also, if you do open a coffin within a certain time, the body may not look decomposed, but may be lying in its own fluids. So part of early vampire lore was that these creatures would collect blood to sleep in, which was thought to help keep them young and alive. This was also where a vampire's blood craving is thought to have come from. Camilla's grave was like this. In fact, the vampire was found supple and soft and lying in a pool of his own blood. So perhaps she was lying in a lead-lined coffin. The creation of vampires in Carmilla is also done thoughtfully. Some folklore thinking went along the lines of if you took your own life, you stood a chance of returning as a vampire, which is why some of the bodies of people who have taken their own lives were buried at crossroads with a stake through their bodies. Lefanu changes this very slightly to if an evil person takes their own life, and this bit I'm not sure I got. Either the spirit can infect the object of their affection, or they turn themselves and then infect. Either way, I really appreciated the inclusion of the evil person element, rather than the memory of a person in pain vilified. It's a small change, but from what I've read it seems that Sheridan's wife either had or developed mental health problems and died in somewhat mysterious circumstances. I say mysterious, but I think they were just kept private, but it could explain this slightly more nuanced version. Another trait that Carmilla sets are mood swings. I haven't read another vampire prone to lethargy, but calm vampires who are occasionally prone to temper to let their true nature slip through now and then. That feels like canon, and it seems like Sheridan may have used his wife as inspiration for this as well. If he did use the experiences of life with his wife, it could explain why Camilla's personality and symptoms felt real and not overdone. If you want to know more about the vampire pandemic, I urge you to watch Ask a Mortician's video on the subject. I've also included all my sources on the vampire pandemic and all the various other things I've talked about if you want to get into the nitty-gritty. But with that, what's your favourite piece of vampire lore? Let me know in the comments. In the meantime, I hope you have a great time of day you are in. Stay spiffy and give ears to the notification bell if you feel so inclined. Toodles. Steeped in the infidem, he was staked through the heart, decapitated.